Hello everyone, this is lifespan development for social work, and this is our 10th lecture, and the topic for this lecture is development of the self. So when we talk about the development of the self, let's look at what are the roots of self-awareness. It is clear that we are not born with a knowledge that we exist independently from others and from the world. That is, there's not a distinct sense of self at birth. The roots of self-awareness, and what I mean by self-awareness is this knowledge of oneself, that is, being different or separate from others, doesn't really begin until around 12 months of age. Psychologists have been able to test for this idea of self-awareness through what they call the mirror and rouge task, where they put a little rouge or makeup on the nose of an infant. Younger infants before the age of about 11 to 12 months won't really respond much to that, but older infants and of course toddlers, they'll touch their nose and try to wipe off the rouge, which when they're looking at themselves in the mirror, they realize that that's them, that they're seeing themselves in the mirror, which is a, so to speak, reflection of their self-awareness, of being individuals and being separate from others. Let's see, this ability to deal with these kind of tasks, such as the rouge, mirror and rouge task, implies consciousness, and that they therefore are able to carry out the task of, in this case, wiping off the nose. It should be noted that children's cultural upbringing also impacts the development of self-recognition. So, for example, when we look at research dealing with children from Greece, they show an ability at self-recognition at an earlier age than, let's say, children who are born in Cameroon. There's really not any clear hypothesis as to why this might be the case, although some people hypothesize that perhaps children, particularly in Western cultures and countries, let's say such as Greece, may encourage the caregivers of infants, I should say, may encourage a sense of individualism and a sense of self earlier, because a sense of self is held to a higher esteem than, let's say, a culture like Cameroon, where there may be less of an emphasis on individualism. So this brings us to theory of mind. And what is meant by theory of mind? Theory of mind is basically a knowledge and a belief about how the mind works and how it influences behavior. And theory of mind is basically the capacity to understand intentionality and causality based on thought. It's an understanding that we think, and that not only do we think, but other people think. And that thinking can influence reactions, choices, behaviors, etc. Infants at a very early age show a capacity to understand some kind of intentionality and causality, but this ability is really grows across time in infancy. So at birth, there's not much of this. Children or infants, newborns, don't really show this ability, but as a child grows, particularly within that first year, we start seeing children's ability to self-recognize and then also be able to understand intentionality and causality. By the age of 2, infants demonstrate empathy, and this is empathy here is an emotional response that corresponds to the feelings of another person. It's the ability to understand that others have a certain type of feeling and to understand an emotional and cognitive level this emotional expression or experience of others. This is a good example of theory of mind. Self-concept in the preschool years also develops. So when we're talking about toddlers up to about the age of about 4 or 5, we see that children's self-concept or their identity or set of beliefs about who they are, what they are as individuals, continues to grow and continue to develop. Now, a typical aspect of this self-concept in preschool years is that children tend to overestimate their real skills and knowledge. They tend to, we would say they tend to be a bit grandiose, let's put it that way. Not because they are actually grandiose, but that their estimation or their ability to estimate their abilities tends to overestimate what they're actually capable of doing. Because children at this age, because preschoolers at the age really do not have the ability to compare their performance against others in an accurate way, their self-concepts therefore are then inaccurate, and they tend to be overly optimistic about their future and about their ability to, for example, accomplish a task that is presented to them. Nonetheless, this positivity, if you will, is helpful because it helps children, it motivates them to take chances and to try new activities. Imagine if children at this age were to underestimate on average their abilities. They probably would tend to avoid doing new activities or trying new skills or tasks, which is a very important ability to have at this point in life, since much of what children are faced with when they are toddlers and preschoolers is new to them. Also, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, culture and self-concept is really intermingled here. So although we could talk about children and individual child self-concept, it's difficult to tease out or to totally ignore culture and a culture's the cultural notion about self-concept. So, for example, some cultures tend to be more collectivistic versus individualistic in its orientation. Collectivistic, what I mean by that is that the notion of interdependence, of blending in, of being interconnected, the notion of that the group's needs are given greater weight than the needs of each individual within that group, that is what is meant by collectivistic. Individualistic orientation tends to emphasize the personal identity, personal uniqueness, competition, and the needs of the individual tend to be of equal or greater importance than that of the group. In Western cultures, we tend to see a stronger emphasis on individualistic orientation, and in Eastern cultures, in certain native cultures, tribal cultures, we tend to see a more collectivistic emphasis. This is not to say that there aren't elements of individualism or collectivism in either of those kind of broad categories, but there tends to be a stronger emphasis on one over the other. And so therefore, this point of view can influence the notion of self-concept. If you think about it, as I said earlier, probably self-concept, that of the individual, is more highly prized in cultures that emphasize an individualistic orientation than in a collectivistic orientation. So that's something to kind of keep in mind while we talk about self-concept. And in fact, we notice, for example, that self-concept and gender and race and ethnicity often interact with each other when we look at these studies. For example, if we take gender, and what I mean by gender is the sense of being either masculine or feminine, this sense of gender for children tends to be well established by the preschool years. So before the ages of 4 or 5, we see children having a clear sense of them being more masculine versus more feminine. Preschoolers are affected by their culture's attitudes towards gender, towards race, and towards ethnic groups. So also, for example, racial awareness comes rather early in preschool years. Infants, for example, can detect different skin colors, although they're not able to really attribute what these skin colors are related to as far as race or ethnicity. That comes later in preschool years. Also, these meanings about what society thinks about certain racial tones, gender, race, ethnicity, that also comes later with children. Nonetheless, by the time a child is about 3 or 4 years of age, preschoolers can distinguish between members of different races. They can identify their own race. They begin to understand the significance of race in society. Some youngsters also begin to show mixed feelings about their own racial or ethnic identity, and this is particularly true for children who are from ethnic minority and racial minority communities here in the United States. Many minority children experience ambivalence over the meaning of their racial identity, and this brings up the notion of what is called race dissonance. It's the phenomenon in which youngsters from minority or ethnic minority communities indicate a preference for the majority values or people. So there's this notion that sometimes we see children valuing norms of the majority culture over their own culture, own community's values. They may view people, for example, in the United States, the majority culture tends to be is white. So we see that children from ethnic minority communities may choose white people as being more intelligent or as being more beautiful, etc. So we see this kind of race dissonance, as it's called in the literature. Sense of self in middle school. Now we're talking about kids who are well into school age, 6, 7 to about 10, 11 years of age. And the shift in self-understanding for a child, according to the literature, shifts from a physical or a concrete view of abilities to a more psychological sense of one's abilities. So by middle school, children begin to view themselves less in terms of external or physical attributes or concrete aspects of self, and in terms of more psychological traits. Due to this increase in cognitive skills and in cognitive development, children's views of themselves during middle childhood becomes more abstract. So their views become more complex because of this. Children seek endeavors in which they can be successfully industrious, use both their physical as well as their psychological or cognitive skills. This is really very much similar to Erikson's idea of psychosocial development about industriousness or being industrious during this period of life. Children also become divided into personal and academic spheres. So they're able to evaluate themselves not just globally, but in very specific areas. So they look at their abilities academically, maybe they look at their abilities in sports, maybe they look at their abilities with maybe their social skills with others. So they're able to kind of divide out different aspects of themselves and judge themselves and rate themselves differently across those different spheres. adolescence is probably one of the idea of self-concept and who a person is, how a person identifies, becomes much more acute, much more intense, and much more complex during adolescence. And so we see this kind of search for identity or search for self, if you will. Who am I? What am I like? Etc. So identity questions really take center stage in adolescence. Now, this is not to say that these questions don't continue throughout the life cycle for individuals, but it becomes much more intense now. This is probably the first period, although we see some of that going on with, toddlers, preschoolers, and middle school aged kids. We see this sense of self or self-concept intensify or magnify substantially. These issues of identity grow in importance as adolescents' intellectual capacities become more adult-like. The brain continues to grow, continues to develop that specificity, the ability to think abstractly improves substantially during adolescence. And so therefore they are able to compare themselves to others. Not only are they able to compare themselves to others, but they're able to compare themselves to a standard that other people might have. Now, children younger than this, particularly middle childhood, children start to be able to show that ability to compare themselves against a standard, but adolescents are able to do this across multiple standards, multiple areas of their lives. Across, what I mean by multiple standards, standards of society, their own standards, the standards of their peers, the standards of adults, the standards across different cultures. So there are multiple ways that adolescents are able to compare themselves against an abstract standard, an ideal standard, if you will. So these areas of self-concept, what am I like, who am I, etc., continue to develop and advance at a substantial rate. Let's see, I've already mentioned that they are able to compare themselves across multiple facets of themselves. They are able to separate others' views of self from their own perceptions of identity. So we start seeing adolescents, people are able to now say this is my standard versus another person's or another group's standard, and that's fine. They are able to recognize various aspects of the self simultaneously, including aspects of the self that are contradictory. They are better organized. They have a more coherent sense of self. And as I said, teenagers, adolescents are able to use abstractions, abstract thinking, not just concrete ideas to compare themselves against. Now, we really get into this identity formation, sense of self. Let's remember Erikson's idea of identity versus identity confusion stage, and that this is a very important task. It's the main task of adolescence, according to Erikson's. Really, if you think about it, and according to the research as well as Erikson's ideas, as well as other researchers after him, they've been able to show that adolescents, and remember, before I go a step further with this idea, remember that we're talking about a process across a number of years. So we're not expecting that 13-year-olds to have a sense of self to that of 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds, okay? So we expect some confusion, we expect some turmoil, etc., that there's a crisis that occurs, a psychosocial crisis that occurs. We expect that for individuals during this age period. But if we get into young adulthood and we look at young adults who have not been able to successfully achieve some sense of self, some coherent sense of self, there's a possibility that they may adopt socially unacceptable roles to express what they do not want to be. Okay. They may have trouble forming and maintaining lasting close relationships. They may follow a dysfunctional path because their sense of self is diffuse. They have a failure to organize around a central unified core identity. So these are important tasks that adolescents need to accomplish in order to move on to the next phase. Again, this is not to say that people don't have identity crises throughout the life cycle, but this is the first real period that we start to see this in individuals. Okay. Those who do forge an appropriate basic sense of self set a foundation for future psychosocial development. They learn of their own unique capabilities as well as their own liabilities, and so therefore they're able to emphasize their capabilities. They develop an accurate sense of self, not only their own sense of self, but how others may view them. And they prepare to take advantage of their unique strengths. This can influence career choice, further education, future partners, romantic partners, their relationships with family members, friends, neighbors, now that they are moving from childhood into adulthood. Another aspect of this identity formation is what James Marcia has added to Erikson, and this is the idea that there may be several ways that individuals, adolescents, may deal with this crisis. They may do it through what he called identity achievement, through identity foreclosure, through a moratorium, and through identity diffusion. Now, again, one individual could go through all of these, okay? Or a person might choose one of these kind of approaches to dealing with identity for a period of time. But then they eventually achieve a more coherent sense of self, of who they are. Identity achievement deals with exploring alternatives, considering alternatives about the self, about what is of value, what is important, what are the strengths, weaknesses, etc. of the other individual, without a specific commitment at that point in time. Identity foreclosure is when adolescents make a firm commitment about who they are, but very early in the process. So they kind of foreclose. They kind of end the process earlier than most of their peers. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but the person may find that as they get older, who they thought they were may not exactly be completely accurate, because they may have foreclosed who they were or the process a little bit sooner in the process than maybe they needed to. A moratorium is when people kind of put to the side who they are. They purposely choose not to focus on these issues. And yes, it is possible that an adolescent can decide, or particularly an older adolescent can decide to kind of put some of those final questions to the side until they're a little bit older. Sometimes people do this by, putting aside marriage, or putting aside a relationship, or a more permanent relationship, or ongoing relationship, or putting aside what career they're going to choose or they're going to pursue on a long-term basis by going to school, let's say, or by joining the military, or by going on a missionary period, or by joining the Peace Corps, or something of that sort. So they kind of put things to the side while they pursue these other interests, these kind of more generic interests, if you will. And then the idea is that hopefully through that additional period of time, they have a better sense of self. The thing about the moratorium is that it could create, if it continues indefinitely, this idea of identity diffusion, where adolescents explore various options, but they never commit to one. And so they're always kind of somewhat lost about who they are, what priorities they have, what's important to them, what goals they want to try to achieve as individuals. Okay. Now, I wanted to return to identity, race, and ethnicity because it once again becomes, and will continue to be, it continues to be somewhat of an issue throughout the life cycle. And forming an identity presents alternative, extra, if you will, maybe not extra, but additional diverse kinds of challenges for members from minority, ethnic, and racial backgrounds. There are different ways of approaching the notion that we are a multicultural society, and individuals take different approaches to dealing with that as well. Cultural assimilation, this model holds that individual cultural identities should be assimilated into a unified kind of overarching cultural norm. It's almost the idea of that we all kind of melt together into one kind of unified sense of self. A pluralistic society model suggests that the U.S. society should be made up of diverse but co-equal cultural groups that should preserve their individual culture features while also participating in the overall general or majority culture. Also, there's this notion of a bicultural identity, which suggests that adolescents can draw from their own culture and while also integrating themselves into the dominant culture. Also, we see with adolescents and young adulthood in particular, this notion of biracial identity or bicultural identity. So an individual might have, for example, parents from two different racial communities as their parents, and they themselves are then biracial. Probably the biggest example that we have of that in the United States is our president, who had a white mother and an African Kenyan father, a black father, white American mother and a Kenyan black father, and so he could be considered bicultural or biracial. Of course, the way a person identifies is also important, and so individuals may choose to identify one way over another for various different reasons. We're not going to really move into that a lot here, but there are some individuals who choose to not necessarily identify biculturally, biracially, etc. Okay, defining the self through the life events. Probably, although some of these identity issues continue into young adulthood, the identity issues that we talked about in adolescence, adulthood adds an additional new piece to the puzzle of self-identity, and that is the social clock. So what is meant by the social clock? There is no social clock in reality, but there is this notion in research, particularly in psychological and sociological research, that there is this psychological cultural timepiece that records the major milestones in people's lives, which were fairly uniform until the middle of the 20th century. Now, that doesn't really give you, frankly, I took that definition from the book just to kind of, keep things similar between the lecture and the text and the readings. But what is meant by a social clock? Literally, social clock is the idea that society has certain norms that it expects adults to conform to by certain age periods. Okay. So there's notion that, for example, in the past, the majority of individuals in society would be married by young adulthood. Not only that, but by young adulthood, they would become parents. And starting in the 50s and 60s, not only would they be married and be parents, but they would own property and they would have their own car. Now, I'm talking about a social clock based on American norms from 50 to 60 years ago. But that's the idea, that if somebody's not married by a certain age, there's a problem for that individual. That's a problem. If they don't have children by a certain age, that's a problem. Now, of course, when we talk about childbearing, yes, you do have to have children by a certain age due to the physiological changes that occur as people age. But a social clock really is not as interested in those biological markers as much as that it is a cultural norm. So that, for example, women should start having children by the time they're in their early to mid-20s, for example. Again, I'm going back to the social clock or the social norms for what adults should achieve by a certain age period from 50, 60 years ago. This brings up the notion that women are particularly, although all people are faced with the social clock, there are certain norms that people should hit or meet by a certain age period. Although all people are faced with this, women in particular are faced with this because of the issue around child rearing, childbearing, etc. Helsin has done a lot of research in this area, and she particularly examined women whose social clocks were focused on families, careers, or on more individual or specified goals. She found that traditional feminine behavior changed over time, so that this behavior increased. That is, the social clock was very present and very relevant for women when they were in their 20s. But then, as women got older, they moved into their late 20s and 30s and early 40s, these social norms or social clock diminished or became less important or less powerful on women's behavior and on the choices that they made. Also, she noticed that sex role specialization and specification, again, social clock not only is true for all individuals, but there are specific norms for women, adult females, and adult males, according to this kind of social clock norms. And again, we see this not only in Helsin's research, but also in research in general, that these kind of sex norms, gender role norms tend to have the strongest impact for young adults during their 20s and early 30s. And then these norms begin to attenuate or become less important as people become older. So Helsin believes that social clock, this notion of a social clock, although it can be important, it depends on the developmental stage or what part of adulthood we're talking about, firstly. Secondly, there are individual differences. So there are some people where the social clock seems to be of little importance, and then there are other people where the social clock, this notion of a social clock, is highly important. Okay. I would also argue that social clock will tend to be more important for individuals from a more collectivistic community versus a more individualistic community. Okay. Social clock, because in collectivist communities, roles, obligation, and those roles and obligations that are attached to those roles are tied to the well-being of the greater good, the greater community of the group. Remember, group norms tend to be more highly valued than the individual desires or goals, or the goals of individuals within those groups. So social clock tends to have a stronger pressure, can have a stronger pressure for individuals from a more collectivistic perspective than from a more individualistic perspective. Excuse me. So, we've been talking about self-concept, and we mentioned that when people look at themselves, they also judge themselves. They also evaluate themselves. Remember when we were talking about middle school children, children are now able at that point to judge themselves against a standard. And this intensifies in adolescence. And then, of course, the whole idea of a social clock means that there is a standard in which people evaluate themselves against. Gee, am I meeting what is expected of adults at the right time in adulthood, shall we say? Self-esteem is really an individual's overall self-evaluation and specific evaluation. What do we mean by that? Overall meaning there's an overall sense of who the person feels they are and how they evaluate or judge themselves, negatively or positively. And then they can judge themselves, evaluate themselves across multiple domains of their lives. So somebody might have a higher self-evaluation for one area of their lives while having a more negative self-evaluation for another part of their lives. So self-esteem is really about how a person evaluates themselves, how they judge themselves, overall and across specific domains. This self-evaluation can be positive or negative. When we say that a person has a high self-esteem, we're saying that they have a more positive evaluation. When a person has a more negative self-esteem, or low self-esteem, I should say, they have a more negative evaluation of themselves. Children increasingly, as I said before, increasingly compare themselves to others and to other standards, to their own standards as well as the standards of others. Also, self-esteem for children tends to grow or increase during middle childhood. So although we have young children, where I was saying earlier when we have preschoolers who judge their skills as being, they overestimate their abilities, that's not necessarily self-esteem. Okay? Self-esteem includes a sense of self-evaluation, typically against a standard. One's own standard, other standard, typically multiple standards, especially when we get into adolescence and adulthood. So a person can judge themselves or evaluate themselves in an overall evaluation, but using multiple criteria, multiple standards, in order to come up with that overall evaluation. In adolescence and in adulthood, we do start to see differences in self-esteem. In adolescence, for example, not only do they have their own standards, as we've talked about themselves, but they learn to differentiate between knowing and liking themselves. So a person can have actually a fairly accurate sense of who they are, but not like themselves very much. Also, adolescents increase their accuracy about themselves, believe it or not. Now, this is not to say that people are always accurate about themselves, and I include adults in this case, but the overall accuracy improves with age for adolescents. And then I think I've already said before that adolescents can evaluate themselves across different aspects of themselves. Self-esteem, of course, continues well into adulthood, and that continues through older adulthood as well. And it continues to be a central component of a person's self-identity. Elderly people, for example, will evaluate who they have been and how well they have managed their lives. Middle-aged people, I don't think I included that in here. No, I did not include that in this slide, but middle-aged people can evaluate themselves as to maybe how they physically are changing with the aging process. Now, again, although there's a similarity to, let's say, preschoolers who are judging their physical characteristics and abilities, again, that's very concrete. When we look at middle adulthood, they have lots of abstract as well as concrete measures to use, if you will, to judge themselves by. And so, therefore, we see that somebody's self-esteem can be very high in one area of their lives while being much lower in another part of their lives. And we see that this could even intensify during adulthood, later adulthood. Also, race and ethnic identity, and as well as race, attitudes towards race, societal or cultural attitudes towards race and ethnicity can influence self-esteem. Now, early research showed, and what I mean by early research, I'm talking about research from the 50s and 60s. So this is very old research from 50, 60 years ago. This showed that self-esteem of minority groups, this is particularly included black children, with some Latino children included, but primarily included black children, that the self-esteem of minority groups was lower than that of majority groups due to prejudice and discrimination. And this conclusion was based on the work with African American children who demonstrated this lower self-esteem. But more recent work really debunks this general conclusion from this older research. Different racial and ethnic groups have different levels of self-esteem as they develop more complex views of racial identity. So guess what? Just as a person can have multiple ways of judging themselves and multiple self-esteems, if you will, which can fluctuate across time, about other areas of their lives, this can also be the case with one's racial or ethnic identification, with dealing with prejudice, racism, etc. So adolescents grow an identity that is more closely with their minority group from which they are from, or from which they belong to. And in fact, adolescents tend to show an increased self-esteem about their ethnic background and their group membership in a particular ethnic or racial community. So this actually develops and improves. So while we saw some mixed attitudes, let's say with preschoolers and especially middle school or older children, I should say, I was going to say middle-aged children. With well, there are middle-aged children, but that's a whole other conversation. With children, older children in adolescence, we start to see that overall, these kinds of questions, confusion, what have you, diminish, disappear, and a real sense of identity around ethnicity and race develops, and people have a stronger, more positive sense of their own racial or ethnic background. According to social identity theory, if minority groups do not accept the negative views of their group held by the majority group, their self-esteem will not suffer. Group pride and ethnic awareness grows with adolescence, which I've already mentioned before. Cultural sensitivity to multiculturalism is apparent for adolescents from ethnic minority communities. adolescents focus preferences and priorities on areas of success in their lives. That is, adolescents from minority communities tend to not focus so much on the prejudice or racism that they must face, but as a way, but they focus on those areas they can be successful in, which is an adaptive strategy, a very positive adaptive strategy. So again, social identity theory posits that individuals and groups tend to have intact, as we say, self-esteem, or positive, high self-esteem, when they reject or do not accept the negative views of their groups that is held by the majority group. And there are different ways that communities and individuals are able to do this, one of which, as I said before, is adolescents. In one study showed, minority adolescents showed that instead of focusing on these negative stereotypes, they focused on areas of success in their lives as a strategy for dealing with that. There also are some differences based on gender and ethnicity. If we combined those two, or ethnogender is a term that is used in some research and scholarship, we do find some differences. So for example, when we look at African American males and Latino males, they tend to have higher self-esteem than their female counterparts. Also, females from Asian and Native communities, Native American communities, tended to have the lowest self-esteem. Oh, sorry, I'm mixing this up, sorry. African American and Hispanic males, Latino males, tended to have the highest self-esteem in all groups. That's what I meant to say. And Asian and Native American females tended to have the lowest levels of self-esteem. Very interesting. So race or ethnicity, when combined with gender, we start to see even other differences around around self-esteem. Speaking of gender, when we deal with self-esteem and adolescence, we do see, especially with early adolescence, that girls report lower levels of self-esteem than their male peers. And this is across all racial and ethnic communities. Obstacles that girls, adolescent girls, often must face in order to have a higher self-esteem include issues of physical appearance, physical attractiveness, social success amongst peers, I should say, to be much more specific, academic achievement, as well as other social norms or expectations based in their families, in their communities, etc. Boys do have self-esteem challenges as well, excuse me, and their pressures tend to be around appearing confident, being tough, and being competitive. But again, especially in early adolescence, the research is pretty clear that girls overall tend to report lower self-esteem than boys. Some of this might also be a bias effect. What I mean by that is that there may be a reporting bias. Girls may feel a need to report a lower self-esteem because having too much of a high self-esteem for girls may be viewed in a negative light. But boys need to be more confident and be more sure of themselves, and so they tend to report a higher self-esteem. So some of that also might be due to gender stereotypes that influence the way in which people respond to scales. Socioeconomic status and self-esteem can also be a part. We don't talk a lot about class and socioeconomic status, but indeed socioeconomic status is intertwined with self-esteem. With adolescence, we see pretty consistently that adolescents who come from higher socioeconomic status communities tend to report higher levels of self-esteem than poor teens. Probably some would suggest this is due to social comparison. Again, we talked about this, that adolescents will do this kind of social comparison. We see this with older childhood, but this ramps up even more with social comparisons. In adolescence, we just talked about teenage girls comparing themselves against all sorts of different standards that they now have to face as they move into adulthood, and the kind of norms that women have to face. Adolescent girls are now starting to face that much more intensely as they move through adolescence. Well, we also see this with socioeconomic status. And children use social comparison, especially adolescents, to judge themselves, to evaluate themselves. Social comparison is, again, a desire to or the ability to evaluate one's own behavior, expertise, etc., by comparing oneself to those of others. Also, sometimes children make downward social comparisons. And what is meant is that children, particularly adolescents, older children will do this, but adolescents will do this more, where they boost their self-esteem by comparing themselves to people who are, or groups that are perceived to be less popular, less valued, who are given less priority. This is kind of one way that adolescents try to boost their self-esteem. With adults, we see that adults don't use that as often. Adults still use that, by the way, but not as consistently as adolescents to boost or to raise self-esteem. Peers also play a very important role, especially for adolescents. Essentially, peers are a reference group and are probably one of the most important reference groups. We mean, what is meant by reference groups are any groups of that people use to compare themselves against. Again, we start seeing this in older childhood, that older children start to use their peers as a reference group, as a comparison group. That is, they compare the self against this group. Adolescence, this intensifies, and this continues well into adulthood. But peers are particularly an important reference group for adolescents, their own age group. Adults tend to have different reference groups. They may have reference groups for their specific role. So what do other mothers do now that I'm a mother? Or what do my peers at work do? What do my colleagues do who are in the same, line? Let's say that's specific line, maybe beginners or management, mid-management. One manager may compare herself against other managers. So there can be multiple reference groups for adults. Again, adolescents tend to emphasize peers. The interesting thing about peers, though, I don't want to be totally negative about peers. Adults tend to be negative about adolescent peer groups, but peer groups can also have a positive influence on individuals, individual adolescents. So peers provide information about what roles and behaviors are most acceptable. They present norms or standards against which adolescents judge themselves, and norms that are unique to that generation, unique to that group, that are different from, let's say, the family or the community that the child is originally from. So it kind of expands the lens for adolescents. Particularly initially, it expands the lens for adolescents as far as how to judge themselves, how to evaluate themselves. And membership in a particular group it is not necessarily required for referencing. What I mean by that is one does not have to be a member of a group to use a group as a reference point. So let's say if we take a poor, let's say we have a adolescent who's from a rural community, a poor rural community, and they are bused in, let's say, to a suburban or a city school. They don't necessarily have to be a member of the group of adolescents who are from the suburbs, let's say, or who are middle class, to use that group as a reference point. Somebody can use a group that they're not a part of as a reference point as well. So a poor student can say, well, gee, my family is not affluent. My family is not economically, we're not stable. We don't have all those things that, let's say, my peers from middle class families have. So this poor adolescent uses a reference group, that is in this case middle class students, students from middle class families, as a reference group, although that particular student is not a member of it. Okay, so what are the consequences of self-evaluation, particularly of self-esteem? And typically the research literally focused on low self-esteem for many years, but there's been a lot of research now that has been looking at high self-esteem as well. Everyone experiences periods of low self-esteem. Likewise, as I've already said before, somebody can have low self-esteem in one area while having moderate to high self-esteem in the majority of other areas of that person's life. Positive self-esteem has desirable consequences, and lower self-esteem tends to be related to negative results. For example, children who are who display or report chronically low self-esteem may become enmeshed in a cycle of failure that is difficult to break. They may continue to fail, they assume that this is what they will always do, and they continue to fail again. They may also avoid trying new things. So they may kind of get stuck in areas that maybe they do have some difficulties being successful in. But because of low self-esteem, they don't try other areas that they might be very successful in or have more strengths in. Okay? So it can create, unfortunately, a feedback loop, if you will, where a child fails. This kind of reinforces a sense of low self-esteem, and then they continue to fail again. But the same is also true for those who have higher self-esteem. They can have what they call cycles of success, where they focus on their strengths, they emphasize areas where they have strengths, they tend to be successful, and guess what? They continue to try in that area that they're successful in. Because a person has a higher self-esteem, they tend to try other things because they start generalizing the sense of higher self-esteem. Just like the person with lower self-esteem generalizes to other areas, same thing with higher self-esteem. If a person fails in a new area, they do not assume it's due to themselves. They tend to assume that it's due to perhaps they didn't quite do the task correctly. And what do? They tend to try again to see if they can be successful the next time. So there's greater persistence due to self-esteem. So people with lower self-esteem, we see this in children, but this is also true with adults. We tend to see them give up sooner and not try new things. People with higher self-esteem tend to persist more and tend to try more or different things. Okay. So I also wanted to focus on immigrant children. I think this is America is a country of immigrants. We have this has been true for hundreds of years. And there's been some research about what is life like for children and adolescents who come here as immigrants, as well as for children who are born into immigrant families. And when we talk about immigrant families, I want to be really clear that you can have a family where you have the parents, grandparents, maybe aunts, uncles, cousins who come over. Children are already born and are raised in the U.S. You have another family that comes over, very similar family. Children are already born, but then new children are born in the United States. Then you may have a young couple that comes here. They have no children, and then all of their children are born here in the United States. Okay? These are children of immigrant families. We're looking at the parents as the immigrants and the children, whether they are immigrants themselves or are born here. We still think of them, or the literature tends to think of them, or research tends to look at them as immigrant children, or children from immigrant families, I should say. More than 13 million children in the U.S. are the children of immigrants. Children in immigrant families typically do quite well in the United States. Why? Some of the children who come here, the socioeconomic status of their families tends to improve once they come to the United States. Some of the immigrants who come to the United States come from well-educated and higher socioeconomic status families. Typically, immigrant parents tend to be highly motivated to succeed, and they place a high value on education, which they then kind of pass on to their children. Immigrant children often come from societies that emphasize collectivism, which we've already talked about. And so therefore they feel it is their duty to succeed as part of, as being proud members of their family and to bring pride to their families. These patterns are most clear for for older children. Okay? The story is less clear for adolescents. So although we see these trends, which I just described above, for older children, even preschool children, I would include them as well. If the child is an adolescent when they come to the United States, or during adolescence, if they were born in the United States, or they came to the United States at a younger age, we start to see a breakdown in some of these patterns that I just mentioned. Okay, some of that may be due to just the usual issues that adolescents go through. Okay, so there's a little bit of a disruption in the pattern due to adolescence and some of the identity issues that we've already talked about in the lecture. Some of these may be due to differences between adolescents and their immigrant parents. We sometimes see that difference. Sometimes adolescent children may be more assimilated in the mainstream culture than their parents, and so sometimes there can be cultural differences within the same family, and this particularly comes to light during adolescence. But nonetheless, we do see that the vast majority of children from immigrant families do well, adapt well, and cope well in the United States. Okay, one thing I wanted to mention was also dealing with choosing a career or occupation. This is probably one of the main areas, not the only area, but one of the main areas that people use to really self-identify, particularly in the West and particularly here in the United States. And it is one of the big issues, our main issues, that adolescents struggle with and deal with in adolescence. Although we see with preschoolers, they talk about wanting to be the president of the United States when they get older, and older kids, they start to get a little bit more realistic about what they might want to do as a career or occupation. We really don't see people really grappling with this issue on a more serious basis until adolescence and throughout the rest of the adult life cycle. Eli Ginsberg he created this kind of career choice theory where he felt that people typically move through a series of stages in choosing a career. There's the fantasy period, the tentative period, and then the realistic period. The first stage, the fantasy period, lasts until about the age of 11 and is the period when career choices are made and discarded without regard to the skills, abilities, or availability of job opportunities. So it's really kind of a fantasy. I've just kind of mentioned this briefly. The tentative period really spans out adolescence. This is where people start to grapple with the issue of career and occupation in a more serious way. People begin to think in pragmatic terms about the requirements of various jobs, about their own abilities, about the availability of jobs in the future, etc. And then finally, in early adulthood, people enter the realistic period, during which people explore specific career options, their own specific skill set, their own interests. They know better what they are interested in. They even know better about what they would want to do during the day, every day, in an occupation, for example. And so we see that, according to Ginsburg, people tend to be more realistic. Now, critics have criticized and argued that this framework from Ginsburg is too simplistic. Certainly, some of what he talks about we can attribute to cognitive abilities, the cognitive changes that occur for individuals, so that as people get older, they're able to imagine more, they're able to deal with abstract ideas, and so they're able to become much more complex in their approach to dealing with this major life decision or choice, what have you. We also see this, I would argue, we can even see some of these reoccur in adulthood. So somebody might be in a job or an occupation that they dislike, and they start thinking, I've got to get a new job, and they might go right through these three stages. They may just be in a fantasy period. They're just fantasizing that this other job is going to be absolutely perfect for them. All they have to do is just get another job, and it's going to be this job or that job over there. But it's really kind of a fantasy. They really haven't moved into really looking at what would it mean to do another job. What do they have to go through in order to create a new job or get a new job or move into a new career? Okay. Then there's the tentative period, and then there's the realistic period. Probably for adults, once they decide that they want a new career or a different occupation, they probably move through these periods very quickly. That's what I would assume. I don't have any research to say that, but to support that, but that is what I would assume. Okay, gender and career choices. Gender, particularly if we're talking about 50, 60 years ago, had a major, substantial, concrete impact about what kind of careers or jobs people chose or pursued. And in fact, women were often barred from jobs whether they wanted them or not. Some of these, sometimes they were barred legally from certain jobs. Sometimes it was more socially, culturally. Sometimes it was circumstantially. They were barred from certain jobs. It is now illegal to advertise a position for a man or a woman. But traditionally, women were considered most appropriate for what are called communal professions. And these are occupations that are associated with relationships. Relationship building, relationship creating. Relationships are very important for it's one of the main tasks of the career or job itself. Men, in contrast, were perceived to be better suited for what are called agentic professions. These are occupations that are associated with getting things accomplished. They're very task-oriented. And the job what you see there, the construction worker, is a classic agentic profession. It's also still very male-dominated at this point. Women today are still underrepresented in male-dominated professions such as engineering, computer programming, and I would also say such things as construction work. women in many professions can earn less than men in identical jobs. Between 1950 and 2003, the number of women in the U.S. labor force increased from 35%, which was considered high, by the way, in 1950, to over 60% in 2003. I thought that was a lot higher, frankly speaking, but this is the data that I have. Women make up about 55% of the labor force, so they're a little bit more than what men are in the labor force. I would also say that some professions are female-dominated, and we don't see men going into those professions, as we see women going into at least some previously male-dominated professions. There are a few professions that at one time were considered male-dominated that are now, excuse me, considered female-dominated. And there is this kind of effect that when a profession socially is perceived as having more women than men in it, men tend to either move out of the profession, or younger men tend not to pursue a career in that profession. We see that also happening as well. Also, we see what is called the glass ceiling effect, where women and people from ethnic minority communities are only able to go up so high in the professional ranks, and then they hit this kind of invisible or glass ceiling because of discrimination, because it's just never been done before, so to speak, etc. Immigrants on the job. Around 1.2 million immigrants enter the U.S., representing about 10% of the population, and that's more than double than it was in 1970. Anti-immigrant sentiments are not based on accurate data, however. Particularly when we're talking about a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiments are based on job performance and what they do while they're here or after they move here. And when I'm talking about immigrants, I'm talking about both undocumented and documented immigrants. Now, the research is very clear. Most immigrants ultimately succeed financially. Even if they start off having trouble, they ultimately succeed and stabilize financially. Few immigrants come to the U.S. to get on welfare. Immigrants contribute more to the economy than they take away over time. This is just the facts about immigrant communities. So this is important data. This is data not only, it's longitudinal data, and that is the strongest kind of data that we can have about any kind of social or behavioral phenomenon, not just about immigrants on the job, so to speak. But this is important information to realize about immigrant communities in the United States. Why do people work? So let's get back to the work piece. There's both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is that motivation that drives people to obtain tangible rewards such as money or prestige. Intrinsic motivation is motivation that causes people to work for their own enjoyment or for their own personal satisfaction, not for the rewards. The tangible rewards that work may bring. Many Western cultures and societies tend to subscribe to a Puritan work ethic or the Protestant work ethic, the notion that work is important in and of itself, that you should be busy, that if you idle hands are the devil's workshop, to use an old phrase. But there is still this kind of Protestant work ethic that is very I think very powerful in the United States, so that people need to be busy, people need to be preoccupied, people need to be accomplishing something. You even see this on in some people with their free time, they need to have a task list, and they feel that they've wasted the day if they have not accomplished something. This is very much based on this kind of Puritan or Protestant work ethic. Work brings a sense of personal identity. Work also can be a central element in people's social lives. moving away not just from the Protestant work ethic, but just work in general here in the United States. The kind of work, or the form of work or occupation of a person determines status. And that is still present today. That status is often associated with the kind of occupation or work or career that a person has. This influences job satisfaction. Now, job status, or the status, I should say, not job status. Well, yeah, job status, that is the social status of the job or the occupation, can influence the satisfaction that individuals have in doing that occupation or job. But there are other things as well that can influence job satisfaction. The nature of the job itself, the kind of tasks that a person has to do. The satisfaction increases when workers feel that they have input into the nature of the job. Supervisors, what kind of supervisors, directors that people work for. This is probably one of the major influences on job satisfaction. And then the variety of work that a person has. It's not repetitive, but there are multiple kinds of things that are required of the individual to do. Many of these things can be important across the life cycle for jobs. This can also be very important for the kinds of jobs or work that young adults pursue in their lives. Work in midlife is probably the time of greatest productivity, the greatest period of success, and the greatest earning power for the individual. The factors that make work satisfying undergo a transformation during middle adulthood. So for middle-aged workers, they care more about the here and now qualities of the work. What is it like to be on the job day to day? Changes in job quality are associated with changes in stress levels for both men and women. Is the job more stressful? Is it less stressful? The older the worker becomes, the more overall job satisfaction they report. Some of this may be due to the fact that middle-aged adults have more experience as workers. So they know what's important, they know what to kind of let go, to not be so concerned about. They are more successful, they have more of a skill set, so they experience more success on the job. They have more emotional maturity, and so they tend to be more emotionally stable in their job across time. So we see that some of these kinds of aspects of middle adulthood may contribute to greater job satisfaction. We also see with the lengthening of the lifespan, so that people are now living well into their late 70s and 80s, that people in midlife may choose to change, make a substantial change in their career and occupation. Now, people change their careers in midlife for lots of different reasons. The challenge at the current job, maybe they're just bored with it. They don't want to do it anymore and they want to do something substantially different. The challenges have now become routine from the job. Their jobs have changed in ways that they do not want to change or they do not like. There may be job loss. They have to change because they've lost their job. They are asked to do more in their present jobs with fewer resources. Technological advances may render their jobs obsolete or unenjoyable. They are unhappy with just their own status, and they want a fresh start with a new job. They feel burnt out on their old job. they see midlife as the last time they can make a meaningful change towards more job satisfaction. So it's a now or never kind of mentality that people have about changing their jobs in midlife. So these are the kinds of reasons that people often report in midlife as to why they are willing to make substantial changes in their occupations or jobs. Women also may return to the job market after they have spent some of their time, if not much of their time, in young adulthood raising children. And some women may either not be in the workforce in young adulthood while raising children, young adulthood or into middle adulthood raising children, or they may be in the job market part-time. Once their children have grown, they may decide to re-enter the job market full-time as well. Midlife is, in new professions, face unique experiences. People who enter, midlife adults I should say, in new professions face unique experiences and challenges. They may enter with unrealistically high expectations, which may lead to more disappointment even on the new job. They may find themselves at entry levels with work peers who are considerably younger than them. They find themselves at entry levels, period. They haven't had to deal with an entry-level position in a long time, and they're now having to deal with that for the first time, maybe after a number of years. But also, many middle-aged adults who enter into a new career also report feeling invigorated, excited by the new challenge. They feel like they're young again because they do have to deal with entry-level career challenges. But they already have the experience under the belt to deal with that. It's not to say that the challenges aren't challenges, but they have a reference point. Gee, I did that before in my life. I think I can do that again now at this point in my life. They also report feeling very appreciated and valued as employees, so that when employers give middle-aged new hires, middle-aged adults who are new to the career, to the occupation, an opportunity, when employers give these folks an opportunity, employers often find that middle-aged adults bring an awful lot to their jobs. Okay, this is not to say that, I've already mentioned some of these things. Work life can be difficult. There's burnout, unemployment, and age discrimination. Job satisfaction is not universal in middle adulthood. It's not universal throughout adulthood. Some experience burnout, and this is a burnout, to be very clear, is an experience of dissatisfaction, disillusionment, frustration, and weariness from a job. There can be growing cynicism about one's work. There can be indifference, lack of concern about the quality of work, pessimism towards job. All of this can contribute to burnout. There are many different ways of dealing with burnout. They can come up with new goals for their job. They may shift their job to a different position in the same company or in the same, let's say, same department. They can restructure their jobs so that maybe their work schedule is slightly different to make it more interesting for them. Or, as we've already talked about, they can leave the job and move to a new career. Unemployment for many workers is a hard reality of life. It's becoming much more common than, let's say, 50 years ago in the U.S. economy. At one point, somebody in their early 20s could get a job in a factory, and that individual could think that they had a job for the rest of their lives back in the 1950s. Nowadays, that is no longer the case. We know that for a fact. So people may face unemployment at one point in their lives, or maybe a number of times in their lives. Unemployment can leave people feeling anxious, depressed, irritable. Some data suggests that for every 1% increase in unemployment rates, there's a 4% increase that occurs in both the suicide rate and psychiatric facility admissions. This reminds me of when I was a family therapist in a small mental health community center, in a poor rural mental health community center about 15 years ago. And I could always tell when the economy was doing better. How could I tell that the economy was doing better and people were working again? Our wait list diminished to almost nothing. It's amazing what unemployment, especially prolonged unemployment, can do for individuals, families, and communities when it comes to mental health issues. Also, when we get into age discrimination, we notice that older adults, this includes middle-aged adults and older adults, tend to stay unemployed longer than younger adults. So younger adults can find a new job typically faster than an older, middle-aged or older adult. Employers may discriminate because of age, although research shows that older workers tend to have less absenteeism. They hold the same job position longer. They are more reliable on the job, actually on the job itself. And they are more willing to learn new skills than younger employees. Sorry to all those of you who are younger. How to combat age discrimination? Many people continue to work full or part-time for some part of their late adulthood, by the way, not just middle adulthood, but late adulthood. Age discrimination is a reality, as I've already mentioned, despite the fact that it is illegal, by the way. Mandatory retirement is illegal since the 1970s, with the exception of certain public safety jobs. There is some allowance for that. Again, there's little evidence that supports the idea that older workers' abilities to perform jobs decline enough to demand retirement in an arbitrary age. It is true that as we get into older adulthood, people start to show more difficulties with cognitive abilities, as we have already talked about earlier. But the interesting thing is that the more people can remain cognitively active, that tends to be a buttress against that decline, which is kind of ironic. So it's just very interesting. The most important thing to think about with retirement when we talk about older workers is that the more active retirees can be, the better they tend to do health-wise, cognitively and physically. But age discrimination, unfortunately, is a reality despite the research about what we know about middle-aged and older workers. Okay, that's it for this week. Thank you for listening and watching, and we will be back next week for lecture number 11.